We all look to the future with confidence, believing in the relentless progress that changes our world day by day. Imagine this. We board a Steelbird, a gigantic airship weighing hundreds of tons. This powerful machine, like a living creature, obeys the laws of engineering and science, and we trustingly sit in its heart, surrendering to invisible forces. We are confident that behind its creation stand hundreds of engineers who have tirelessly worked to make the flight safe, and countless hours of testing and strict protocols ensure our safety. Every detail, every nut and bolt, every inspection, everything has been done to conquer even the most demanding gravity, to lift us into the sky and bring us back. We believe in the flawless logic of this machine, in its precise operation and reliability, for it is the fruit of modern engineering genius. But what if all this faith is merely an illusion, concealing a dangerous truth? What if at the very heart of our most perfect mechanisms, behind the shiny metal shell, beneath the hum of turbines and the intricate web of wires, lies something we cannot fully control? What if within this impeccable construction lurks primordial chaos, invisible cracks, forgotten errors, human negligence that can awaken at the most inopportune moment? All these are not fictional stories, but real cases where invisible cracks and errors manifested at the most critical moment, turning a marvel of engineering into a deadly trap. These stories are not about disasters that happen by fate. They are about those who dared to look beyond the possible and miraculously returned, finding themselves on the brink of life and death. They are also tales of those who experience firsthand how thin the line is between sky and earth, and how easily it can tear, leaving behind only fleeting memories of tragedy. Before moving on to the main topic, we would like to ask you for a small support. Your reaction in the form of a like and attention to the content will be an important gratitude and incentive for us to continue telling such stories. Thank you for your understanding. Now let's move to the sky, to those very seconds when fate could turn in any direction. Imagine a flight that lasts exactly 27 minutes. Altitude 5,300 meters, approximately just over 15,000 feet. A regular flight from the city of Birmingham, located in England, to sunny Malaga in the south of Spain. Everything goes according to plan, a crew of 6 passengers eagerly awaiting arrival, enjoying their morning coffee, flipping through newspapers, and anticipating their vacation. In the cockpit, there is a calm and familiar atmosphere. At the controls is Captain Timothy Lancaster, a veteran of aviation, just over 42 years old, with more than 11,000 flight hours under his belt. Beside him is First Officer Alistair Atchison, a 39-year-old experienced pilot entrusted with their lives. The aircraft they are flying is not the newest, but it is time-tested and reliable. It has served British aviation for almost 2 decades. All necessary checks have been completed. The weather is clear, with no signs of impending trouble. At 7:20 in the morning, the plane lifts off the runway, and a standard ascent begins. Everything proceeds as usual. The familiar hum of the engines is heard, passengers enjoy the flight, and in the cockpit, Timothy and Alistair engage in a casual conversation. After reaching an altitude of 17,300 feet, just over 5 kilometers, the pilots engage the autopilot and, out of long-standing habit, loosen their seatbelts. The captain even completely unfastens his lap belt, which is against regulations. But nearly all pilots do this when at cruising altitude. The world-renowned silence of the early morning is shattered at 7:33, just 13 minutes after takeoff, when an unexpected and terrifying moment occurs in the cockpit. At this critical moment, Steward Nigel Ogden enters the cockpit to deliver Captain Lancaster's breakfast order. But at that very instant, a catastrophe occurs that forever changes the fate of the crew and the aircraft. A deafening, terrifying bang, like an explosion, erupts in the heart of the cockpit. The explosion causes an instant and powerful decompression. The air inside the cockpit instantly discharges, turning into a thick, cold mist. At that moment, the left windshield on Captain Lancaster's side is violently torn from its mounts and shoots out like a bullet. Everything not securely fastened rushes out through the gaping hole. Maps, magazines, the pilot's personal items, and Captain Lancaster himself. The force of the powerful explosion literally yanks him from his seat and pulls him outside into open space. His body, propelled at a speed of over 600 kilometers per hour, is thrown from the aircraft like a bird that has lost control. At that moment, it seemed he would perish instantly, vanishing into the icy blue that surrounded him on all sides. But then a true miracle occurred. It was both a blessing and a curse, as it changed the outcome of the entire tragedy. At the last second, as if by fate, Lancaster's legs catch on the control column, preventing his fall. The full horror of the situation descended upon those remaining inside the aircraft, and each of them realized something incredible was happening. First Officer Atchison, despite being stunned and severely disoriented, saw his commander disappearing into the roaring air, rushing out of the breached opening. At that moment, Steward Nigel Ogden, displaying incredible composure and coolness, rushed forward to save the captain. He managed to grab Lancaster by the waistband of his trousers, and his hand became the only barrier between the captain and death from a height of over 5 kilometers. At this time, the cockpit door, which had been torn off its hinges, forcefully slammed into the control panel, blocking the engine throttle levers. The aircraft, with the yoke clamped by the captain's legs and tilted forward, disengaged the autopilot and began a rapid descent. Chaos ensued. Atchison, holding the yoke with one hand, tried to stabilize the plane's fall. With the other, he desperately transmitted a mayday signal, hoping for help from the controllers. But due to the deafening wind roar, he couldn't hear a response or confirm that his message had been received. Meanwhile, Ogden was fighting for the captain's life and the plane's salvation. His body, heavy and resisting the wind's force, threatened to pull him out along with the captain. Lancaster's body, arched, was hitting the fuselage, his head and torso already in the icy stream where the temperature had dropped to -17 degrees. At such speed and altitude, he was threatened with death from asphyxiation, frostbite, and multiple injuries. At this critical moment, 2 more stewards rushed to Ogden's aid. Together, forming a human chain, they held the captain's body, preventing it from being torn away. Through the side window of the cockpit, they could see his face, eyes wide open, unblinking, and blood streaming from his mouth, wounds, and bleeding. He seemed lifeless, and some of them had the fleeting thought, maybe it's time to let go. He's dead anyway. But the struggle for his body continued, putting the entire fate of the aircraft at risk. On that fateful day, everything was going according to plan, and no one could have predicted that in a few hours a real catastrophe would occur, capable of changing the views of the entire global aviation industry. At the center of the events was Captain Lancaster, a man whose feat would forever remain in the memory of those who value life and safety at altitude. He didn't know if his commander was alive because at that moment, the entire crew was in a state of extreme tension, and fate itself seemed exceedingly capricious. He couldn't predict if the stewards would hold out, as their condition was far from normal. They were exhausted, frostbitten, and barely standing. And most importantly, he was completely unaware if he could land the plane himself, as until that moment he had been forced to make decisions under extreme stress and danger. Time, which stretched like an eternity, 35 minutes of battling the invisible force of fate, was gradually coming to an end. And finally, the moment arrived when Atchison, a pilot with a steady hand and calm heart, executed a flawless landing at Southampton Airport. The entire crew, tired, exhausted, and covered in frost, breathed a sigh of relief when the plane stopped moving and came to a halt on the runway. But as soon as the aircraft came to a standstill, the rescue services, prepared for the worst-case scenarios, rushed to the cockpit, expecting to see a horrific scene. They were met by exhausted, frostbitten stewards who were still holding their commander with their feet, clinging to any strength to maintain some hope. The rescuers' gaze immediately fell on the body lying motionless on the fuselage. It seemed lifeless, devoid of any sign of life. Rushing to it, the rescuers began the operation to extract the body, assuming it was a hopeless loss, as they believed it was already a corpse. But at that moment, one of them noticed a faint movement, and the heart of everyone present began to beat faster. It was Captain Lancaster. He slowly opened his eyes, and despite all the trials, his life continued. He survived. In the 22 minutes spent outside at an altitude of more than 5,000 meters, he suffered severe frostbite, fractures of his right arm, wrist, and a finger on his left hand, but he remained alive. His rescue was a true miracle, as only 5 months later he was able to return to flying, once again taking the helm. But how could such an incredible event occur? How could this happen to this aircraft, which seemed designed to withstand colossal pressure changes in extreme conditions? The investigation conducted by the British Air Accidents Investigation Branch, known as the AAIB, revealed a shocking truth that shook the entire aviation industry. It turned out that the cause was not in the aircraft's design defects, but in one person and a small but critically important set, 84 bolts. 27 hours before the scheduled departure, during routine maintenance, the very left windshield was being replaced on the aircraft. The work was performed by the maintenance shift supervisor. He decided not to follow strict instructions, but to act from memory, relying on his own understanding. After removing the old glass, he noticed that the fastening bolts were corroded and decided to replace them. To do this, he went to the warehouse, selecting new bolts based solely on visual selection. He was mistaken. The bolts he took were 0.06 of a millimeter thinner than required. But that was not all. As a result of his work, out of 90 bolts installed on the mount, 84 turned out to be 2.5 millimeters shorter. These short bolts barely held onto the thread, making them extremely unreliable. If the story of Flight 2390 is a tragedy caused by human error, then what happened over the Pacific Ocean on April 28, 1988, is an epic saga of systemic negligence and betrayal of metal. It is a narrative of how an entire aircraft, flying to Paradise Islands, in a matter of seconds turned into a roaring convertible, speeding at 500 kilometers per hour into the void. The distant and mysterious Hawaiian archipelago was the destination of this short, almost hour-long flight from the island of Hilo to the island of Honolulu. In the cabin of this small aircraft were 89 passengers, along with 6 crew members, ensuring the safety and comfort of everyone on board. For this type of plane, such short routes were almost a daily routine. It was like a shuttle bus, shuttling between islands, making several takeoffs and landings each day, a familiar task for the pilots and service staff. The aircraft at that time was only 19 years old. In the aviation industry, such an age is considered quite mature. It indicates that the aircraft has undergone all necessary inspections and technical checks, was deemed operational and ready for flights. On paper, everything looked perfect. However, as one of the passengers was boarding, she suddenly noticed something strange. Near the fuselage door, a crack appeared before her eyes. She paused for a moment, wondering what it might mean, and decided to keep the troubling sign to herself, thinking the crew probably already knew about the situation and would take necessary measures. This small detail, this fleeting doubt, would play a key role in the thorough investigation of the tragedy. The plane takes off, everything goes according to plan. At an altitude of about 7,300 meters, when the pilots level the course and the flight attendants prepare to serve drinks and attend to the passengers, something terrible suddenly happens. A powerful blow is heard in the cabin, and everything around shakes. Passengers in the front part of the cabin see a small hole appear in the left side of the ceiling, as if someone pierced it from the inside. In a split second, this hole expands, turning into a gaping hole from which a stream of air gushes out. Explosive decompression instantly tears off a huge piece of the fuselage, ejecting 5.5 meters of roof and walls, from the cockpit to the wings. Everything that was above the heads of the first-class passengers disappears. The ceiling vanishes, leaving only the sky and endless blue in its place. People in the cabin are suddenly pressed into their seats by the powerful wind pressure. Those who were strapped in their seatbelts remain in their seats, unmoving, but the surrounding reality has changed forever. At this moment, 3 flight attendants were in the aisle. 2 of them, Michelle Honda and Jane Sato, are forcefully knocked off their feet and thrown to the floor by the sudden rush of air and debris. Both suffer serious injuries, yet despite this, they remain in the cabin and continue to perform their duties, trying to help passengers and maintain calm. The third, the most senior flight attendant, 48-year-old Clarabelle Lansing, was less fortunate. She was at the epicenter of the destruction. In an instant, she is pulled out, as if by an invisible hand reaching into the sky over the Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Robert Schornsteimer and First Officer Madeline Tompkins hear a deafening crash. They are instantly thrown back, and they see fragments of insulation and torn wires flying around them. People in the open air observe what's left of the aircraft, wires protruding from the shattered fuselage and rods torn from their mounts. These sights evoke a sense of anxiety and prayers for the fate of the crew and passengers. Meanwhile, the pilots, despite the horror of the situation, manage to establish contact with the ground and request an emergency landing. They descend at an incredible speed, which seems unbelievable, as controlling the aircraft under such conditions is an almost impossible task. The problem is that when descending to a lower speed, the aircraft becomes nearly unmanageable. Therefore, they have to approach the landing at a speed approaching 300 kilometers per hour, which significantly exceeds the usual standards. And just when it seems things couldn't get worse, a new complication arises. The front landing gear indicator doesn't light up green, causing concern. Has it deployed, or will the aircraft, landing on its belly at such high speed, cause a fire or structural damage? There's no time for checks, and the captain makes the decision to land regardless. Those 13 minutes, which seemed like an eternity, passed in agonizing anticipation, starting from the moment of the explosion and ending with the ground touch. The aircraft touches the surface, wind gusts begin to skid it, and it seems like it might flip over or break apart. However, thanks to Schornsteimer's skill and determination, the pilot manages to keep control. In the end, when the aircraft finally stops and rescue services arrive, they are met with a surreal scene. The upper part of the fuselage is simply missing, as if it had been neatly sliced off, and the whole structure resembles an open can. Inside, among the debris and broken panels, are 15 people, 16 of whom sustained injuries of varying severity. 8 were seriously injured, and one of the flight attendants, unfortunately, perished. Her body was never found, adding to the tragedy of this disaster. What were the causes that led to this accident, which became unique in aviation history? The investigation conducted by the National Transportation and Safety Board revealed a number of issues that had accumulated over many years. The main cause was considered to be metal fatigue, but not the usual kind. The aircraft of Aloha Airlines operated in special, extremely aggressive conditions. They performed short flights in a salty and humid marine environment, where each flight created a cycle of decompression and subsequent pressurization. The fuselage constantly breathed, expanding at altitude and contracting upon landing. Over 19 years of operation, this particular Boeing had completed nearly 90,000 such cycles, which was double the design specifications. Salt and moisture caused intense corrosion of the metal, and thousands of load cycles led to the appearance of microcracks at the joints of the skin panels, especially in the so-called bonded joints. Inspectors were supposed to detect these damages, but the existing maintenance program at the time was insufficient. Visual inspections were conducted at night, which significantly complicated the detection of small cracks. As a result, the airline, aiming to reduce costs, ignored the manufacturer's, Boeing's, recommendations for more thorough monitoring of the aging fleet's condition. Consequently, the crack noticeable to a passenger was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the skin lay a whole network of corrosion and fatigue cracks, ready to join at any moment and lead to tragedy. This is exactly what happened at an altitude of about 7,300 meters. A microscopic crack under pressure instantly spread like lightning, and a huge piece of the fuselage was blown out of the structure. This catastrophe of Flight 2437 became a wake-up call for the entire aviation industry. It prompted the Federal Aviation Administration of the United States to take action. The story of the Sky convertible vividly demonstrated that even the most reliable and time-tested aircraft, despite its strength and technological equipment, is not immune to dangerous situations that can arise at the most inopportune moment. It showed that even a seemingly eternal machine, which seems capable of continuing to work indefinitely, is subject to wear and metal fatigue over time, just like any living organism. It is important to remember that no mechanism, no matter how modern and complex, is immune to possible failures. And sometimes these failures can lead to tragedy, even without a powerful explosion or other obvious catastrophic event. Sometimes to face death at an altitude of 10 kilometers, a loud bang, a sudden sound that immediately makes the heart beat faster, and a smell, sharp and acrid, like burning metal, is enough. Such an incident occurred on June 8, 2019, during a Delta Airlines flight from Atlanta to Baltimore. The aircraft of this flight was one of the veteran models, a McDonnell Douglas MD-88, which had been in service for many years and had carried 148 passengers who entrusted their lives to it. Shortly after the plane took off, passengers heard a loud bang. At first, people thought it was just turbulence, which often accompanies flights and causes unpleasant sensations. However, very soon a sharp smell appeared in the cabin. The smell of burning metal, it was acrid and unpleasant, as if someone had lit a torch inside the plane. At that moment, it became clear that the situation was much more serious than just turbulence. The plane began to descend slowly. The interior became hot, the ventilation shut off, and the cabin filled with anxiety. At that moment, one of the passengers, named Logan Webb, noticed through the window a striking scene that sent a shiver down his spine and horror into his heart. He saw that the left engine of the plane was exposed. It was something incredible. One of its central parts, the so-called nose cone or cowl, the large outer part of the engine, had come off, and inside the engine, spinning at high speed, was crashing against the internal parts of the turbine, breaking into pieces. In the center of this damaged engine gaped a large hole from which flames, heated to a bright red, were bursting out. The engine itself seemed turned inside out. Its heart, the turbine, was outside, as if it had been removed and displayed for all to see. Panic rose inside the cabin. Fear gripped everyone on board. But the crew showed professionalism and calmness. The pilots quickly shut down the damaged engine to prevent further dangers and began turning for an emergency landing at the nearest airport, located in North Carolina. Passengers were prepared for the worst as the situation seemed critical, but fortunately the plane landed successfully and no passengers were harmed. After this incident, Delta Airlines issued a very cautious and restrained statement, indicating that there was a possible issue with one of the engines, without giving any more specific details. However, photos and videos taken by eyewitnesses and passengers quickly spread across the internet and told a completely different story. They showed destruction that could not be ignored. Aviation safety experts unanimously stated that this was an extremely serious incident, a so-called uncontained engine failure, which could have led to a catastrophe. If the detached parts of the turbine had pierced the fuselage, damaged fuel tanks, or the aircraft's control system, the consequences could have been tragic. Such a scenario could have led to a complete loss of control and CAT. In that instant moment when the plane's wheels softly touch the runway, something completely unexpected and striking happens. The right landing gear, which was supposed to reliably withstand the load during landing, simply collapses as if cut down and fails to withstand the pressure. As a result of this strong impact, the entire plane begins to tilt. It leans on the right wing, as if desperately trying to maintain balance. The turbine blade, spinning at a speed typical for high-altitude operation, suddenly scrapes against the asphalt, striking sparks from beneath it, as if in a furious battle with the hard surface. At this moment, the aircraft begins to spin, like an angry whirlwind, and it seems as if it is about to lose control completely. But thanks to the quick and coordinated response of the pilots, they managed to keep the aircraft on the runway, preventing a more tragic outcome. Fortunately, none of the passengers were injured in this incident. Despite the terrifying seconds they experienced, everyone safely disembarks, going through the evacuation procedure, and their lives remain intact. However, the question arises, what exactly happened that day? Why did the aircraft suddenly lose stability, even though everything seemed to be in order? This investigation, conducted by the Dutch Safety Board, took over a year. Its findings were astonishing. It turned out that the cause of the accident was not bad weather conditions, stormy winds, or pilot error, but a combination of two hidden defects that had long gone unnoticed. The first was a faulty proximity sensor installed in the landing gear mechanism, and the second, and most crucial, was a microscopic defect in the main landing gear strut fork, the very part to which the wheels are attached. This defect, as experts discovered, had been introduced at the factory during the aircraft's manufacturing. It had been concealed within the metal for decades, showing no signs and raising no alarms. Only on that day, under conditions of strong crosswinds, which created additional stress during landing, and with a faulty sensor, did this hidden defect manifest. The strut, unable to withstand the load, broke. This case became a vivid example of the so-called Swiss cheese model in safety theory. It is based on the idea that a catastrophe does not occur due to a single major error, but when several minor problems, like holes in cheese, align in a single line. A faulty sensor, a manufacturing defect, bad weather. Each of these problems on its own would not have posed a serious threat, but together they created a situation where everything spiraled out of control. Ultimately, it resulted only in the aircraft being damaged and broken, rather than a tragedy with human casualties. This story serves as a reminder that flight safety depends not only on the professionalism of pilots and technical maintenance, but also on the work of those specialists who have been assembling and manufacturing parts at factories for many years. It is often their meticulousness and responsibility that determine the fate of hundreds and thousands of lives. There are stories that forever change our perception of what is possible. One such story is that of United Airlines Flight 2313. It is a tale of how the crew of an aircraft, by all laws of aerodynamics and engineering, should have crashed in the air, but managed to achieve the impossible: control a situation that seemed hopeless. On July 19, 1989, the aircraft, belonging to 10 different United Airlines, took off from Denver to Chicago. On board were 296 people. The flight proceeded under normal conditions until, at an altitude of 11,000 meters, passengers heard a deafening explosion, like a loud and sudden collision. At that moment, the aircraft sharply banked. What happened that day? The entire tragic incident began with the explosion heard by the passengers inside the plane. This explosion was caused by the failure of the second tail engine, but it did not occur as a localized accident. It was a sudden and massive failure. Inside the engine, something very serious happened. The titanium fan disc, which was one of the key structural components, shattered into many pieces. The fragments of this disc, weighing over 150 kilograms, shot out of the engine casing at high speed and, like shrapnel, pierced the aircraft's tail assembly. This unexpected and very powerful burst destroyed all 3 hydraulic systems located in that area, which ran close together. Ironically, this was very dangerous because these systems were responsible for the aircraft's control and stabilization. Designers and engineers considered such a scenario nearly impossible, as the likelihood of such a failure was deemed very low. However, despite all calculations and assumptions, it did happen. As a result of this incredible and terrifying event, the crew of Flight 232 found themselves in a situation that none of them had trained for on any simulator. The aircraft was left without a steering wheel and control pedals, making control nearly impossible. It was living its own life, swaying and entering spiral movements, like a living organism trying to maintain balance. In such a critical situation, Captain Harvey Hines and his team made the only possible, albeit desperate, decision. They realized that the only way to influence the flight was to control the thrust of the 2 remaining engines located under the wings. Working with this limited tool, the captain and his assistant tried to change the aircraft's direction. By increasing the thrust of the left engine, they attempted to turn the airliner to the right, and by increasing the thrust of the right engine to the left. At the same time, by synchronously working both engines, they tried to influence the altitude gain or descent. It was like trying to steer a truck moving down the road by pressing the gas of 2 motorcycles tied to the sides. This method of control was crude, imprecise, and nearly impossible for precise control. However, fortunately, in this critical situation, there was another pilot on board, Dennis Fitch. He made his way to the cockpit and, kneeling, took control of the throttle levers. Meanwhile, Captain Hines and the first officer tried to stabilize the aircraft using the control wheels, which could no longer provide the necessary effect. For 64 minutes, they fought for their lives in conditions of hell and complete uncertainty. During this time, they managed to contact the ground and were directed to the nearest airport in the city of Sioux City, located in the state of Iowa. In conditions where the aircraft could not descend normally or deploy flaps, it flew only in wide right circles. Landing in such conditions seemed impossible. It was a controlled disaster. On the ground, rescue services were already waiting for them, All the fire and ambulance crews in the state were gathered at the runway, which was covered with foam to quickly extinguish any fire if necessary. The crew warned the passengers that the landing would be very rough, with a significant reduction in speed and a steep descent angle. As the aircraft approached the runway, it moved at a tremendous speed and at a steep angle. At the last moment, the right wing touched the ground, causing the airliner to break into 3 parts and catch fire. In the photos capturing this moment, it seems almost impossible to survive in this fireball. But a miracle happened, thanks to the incredible skill of the crew, who managed to keep the aircraft in a more or less horizontal position until the very last moment, and the coordinated work of the rescue services. The situation was nevertheless saved. Of all the 290 passengers on board, Captain Haynes's crew's actions became a truly classic example of how important it is to skillfully manage resources in emergency situations, especially under limited capabilities. This case became a model for training and revising pilot training approaches worldwide. Thanks to such actions, many lives were saved in subsequent years, and many airlines began to pay more attention to training their pilots, understanding how important it is to remain calm and make the right decisions in critical moments. There are many tragedies in aviation that strike with their scale. Some are remembered for their destructive power, others for the drama and emotional intensity of the events. But the story of Flight 123, which occurred 32 years ago, stands out from most other cases. This story is not about an explosion or the instant death of passengers, not about a sudden catastrophe that happened in a matter of seconds. It is a narrative about what happened over 32 minutes, a time filled with horror, despair, and incredible resilience in the face of imminent death. This tragedy is deservedly considered the worst in aviation history involving a single aircraft. It happened on August 12, 1985. Those very 32 minutes became part of a history that shook the entire world. On that day, a giant passenger aircraft, a Boeing 747 of Japan Airlines, was preparing for its flight from Tokyo to Osaka. On board were 524 people, including 509 passengers and 15 crew members. The time was special. It was during the Oan Festival, when Japanese people traveled to their hometowns to honor their ancestors and reconnect with their roots. The plane was packed with passengers, each heading home or on a journey, and everything was ready for takeoff. 12 minutes after takeoff, at an altitude of 7,300 meters, a powerful explosion occurred. This explosion shook the entire aircraft and had catastrophic consequences. The vertical stabilizer, a massive fin responsible for maintaining course stability, broke off from the tail section of the plane. This component was so crucial that without it, controlling the aircraft became nearly impossible. At that moment, dangerous decompression began. The cabin pressure started to drop rapidly. The crew, consisting of Captain Masami Takami and his colleagues, heard alarming signals and saw the cabin pressure dropping, indicating an impending disaster. The most terrifying realization was that the pilots understood the plane was no longer responding to their controls. The explosion in the tail destroyed all 4 hydraulic systems responsible for controlling the aircraft. Unlike smaller planes, such as the DC-10, where the main engines are located under the wings and allow some control even with hydraulic system damage, the Boeing 747 had all 4 engines under the wings. This meant that controlling the plane became nearly impossible because the engine thrust could not compensate for the loss of hydraulic systems. As a result, the aircraft began to oscillate in what is known as phugoid oscillations. It would gain altitude and then rapidly descend, like a sine wave, with each movement risking structural failure. The pilots fought for every second, displaying superhuman skill and courage. Their desperate communications, recorded on the flight recorder, remain as testimony to their heroism. During these moments, they attempted to deploy the landing gear to use it as air brakes and simultaneously manage engine thrust to stabilize the plane. At times, they achieved brief success, and the plane seemed a bit calmer, but then it would again start to plunge. In the cabin, amidst wild shaking and panic, oxygen masks began to drop automatically for the passengers. Many of them, being experienced travelers or simply people caught in a terrifying situation, realized that something was happening. 32 minutes after the dreadful explosion on board the Boeing 747, the plane clipped the slopes of Mount Takamagahara with its wing and eventually broke apart. This tragic incident claimed the lives of all 524 people on board, with only 4 survivors. These lucky individuals, 4 women seated in the tail section of the plane, miraculously survived this horrific event. Their survival was a true miracle, as such disasters usually leave no chance for even the luckiest to survive. The investigation of this tragedy became one of the most complex and puzzling cases in aviation history. During the investigation, a cause was found that turned out to be shockingly surprising and unexpected. The story of this disaster did not begin with the explosion itself. 7 years prior, in the 9th month of 1978, that very plane, a Boeing 747, had a tail strike upon landing. This incident was meticulously documented, and its consequences lingered in the minds of specialists for a long time. After this incident, the plane was sent for repairs, which were carried out by Boeing's technical specialists. During the repair, one of the most crucial structural elements was damaged: the aft pressure bulkhead, a metal partition that plays a key role in maintaining cabin pressure and separates it from the unpressurized tail section. However, during the restoration work, engineers made a grave error. Instead of using a single continuous metal plate with 3 rows of rivets, they secured 2 separate elements connected by only 1 row of rivets. This was a gross violation of technological standards, a violation that might seem insignificant under normal conditions, but in reality became a hidden time bomb. 5 years and 10 months. That was the time elapsed from this repair to the tragedy. During this period, fatigue cracks and microcracks accumulated in the tail section structure, gradually weakening the compromised part. Every breakdown, every pressure change, every shift in temperature and flight conditions progressively worsened the state of the metal. These barely noticeable damages slowly but surely turned into dangerous defects. And then, on that fateful day, August 12, 1985, the pressure bulkhead failed. It exploded like a balloon and shattered. The internal airflow from the cabin, relentlessly escaping outward, struck the tail assembly and it was torn off. Thus ended the tragedy of flight number 123. This event is not just an example of technical failure. It is a cautionary and terrifying tale of how one forgotten mistake, made thousands of kilometers and many years prior, can lead to the death of hundreds of innocent people. This story forced the entire aviation industry to reevaluate its approaches. Not only repair procedures were reviewed, but also the very concept of responsibility that rests on the shoulders of those who build and maintain aircraft. So we have reached the pinnacle of our review, and here at the forefront is not a single catastrophe, but a whole series of interconnected events. This story is one of the foundations of modern civil aviation transport. It became the starting point for numerous changes and innovations. It combines elements of triumph and pride, as well as mysterious deaths and brilliant investigations that forever changed the understanding of aircraft design and operation. This is the story of the legendary aircraft that made history, the de Havilland Comet, the world's first jet airliner. Its story begins in the mid-1950s, when the world, still recovering from a devastating war, stood on the brink of a new revolution in aviation. At that time, the skies were dominated by slow, noisy piston engine planes. But at this moment, Britain decided to reclaim its status as a great technological power and take a step forward. One of the most mysterious and tragic chapters in aviation history began with Flight 781, operated by the British Overseas Airways Corporation. This flight, departing from Rome, was supposed to deliver its passengers and crew to their destination. But just 20 minutes after takeoff, it suddenly disappeared from radar, as if it had dissolved into the silent blue of the Mediterranean Sea. The last radio signal heard by the controllers was nothing more than a brief fragment of the pilot's phrase, and since then, nothing was known about the fate of the aircraft. Witnesses, fishermen near the island of Elba, claimed to have seen a large plane explode in the clear, cloudless sky. They said they heard a powerful explosion, and soon only a distant smoke trail remained in the sky. All 35 people on board perished without a trace. This tragedy shocked the entire world, and within hours of the incident, the entire fleet of British Comets was immediately grounded, and a large-scale investigation was promised to shed light on the causes of the incident. Engineers and specialists involved in the investigation began a meticulous analysis of the aircraft's design. Over several months, they made more than 50 different changes to its technical structure, hoping to eliminate potential defects. After the successful completion of the work, approximately 2 months later, flights were allowed to resume, and the airliners once again soared into the sky. But fate dealt a cruel hand. Just 2 months later, in April 1954, another tragedy occurred. This time, South African Airways Flight 201, departing from Rome, disappeared as suddenly as the first. It vanished in approximately the same area over the Mediterranean Sea where the first airliner had recently disappeared. Again, there was a clear sky, and again, no explanations. None of the passengers or crew survived. This time, 21 people died, and it became clear that this was not a coincidence, but something more sinister and inevitable. This series of tragedies caused unprecedented shock and dismay around the world. The first jet airliner in history, which was supposed to be a symbol of progress and speed, turned out to be a serial killer. As a result of these events, comet flights were permanently and unequivocally halted. Authorities and experts began to seek the answer to the main question: what caused such catastrophes? The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill, personally ordered that the truth be found at any cost. This marked the beginning of one of the most extensive and remarkable technical investigations in the history of civil aviation. The British Royal Navy undertook the extraordinarily complex task of retrieving the wreckage of the first crashed aircraft from the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Over several weeks, specialists conducted an unprecedented operation to locate and recover fragments of the airliner, to study them in laboratory conditions, and understand the causes of the tragedy. Meanwhile, in England, at the famous Farnborough Institute, a massive water tank was constructed. Inside this enormous reservoir, the entire fuselage of another aircraft of the same model, the Comet, was placed. Subsequently, a series of simulated flights began to replicate the conditions under which the actual flights occurred. The tank was filled with water, creating external pressure, while air was pumped inside the fuselage to mimic the conditions of high-altitude flight in extreme altitudes. For several weeks, day after day, engineers and scientists conducted thousands of hours of tests, bringing the conditions closer to reality. Cycle after cycle, experiment after experiment, they meticulously modeled the flights to understand what exactly caused the destruction. And finally, after approximately 3.5 cycles, the moment everyone had been anticipating occurred. At the most critical moment, the metallic shell of the fuselage suddenly burst with a crack. The story of the first jet airliner is a sad and instructive saga about how the human drive to be first in a new field, along with technological arrogance, can blind and lead to tragic consequences. In those years, Britain, which was a leader in the aviation industry, found itself in a situation where it failed to outpace its competitors in the race to create jet aircraft. As a result, the country lost the chance to become a pioneer in this revolutionary field, yielding to its rivals, the Americans. The Americans, having learned lessons from the bitter experience of British engineers, created their own jet airliner, the famous Boeing 707, with an unusual, at first glance, shape of windows, oval windows, which became a symbol of the new era of air travel. This aircraft became the true king of the skies, paving the way for faster, more comfortable, and safer flights for millions of people around the world. But the sacrifices made during this technological revolution were not in vain. Their tragic fate played a crucial role in raising safety standards and rethinking approaches to aircraft design. The demise of the first jet airliners forced engineers to understand one important truth. In the sky, there are no small details. It is precisely such seemingly insignificant details, like the shape of a window, that can become critical factors in ensuring passenger safety. Sometimes the fate of hundreds of people can depend on the simplest and seemingly inconspicuous thing: the shape of a window or the design of components. After these tragedies, it became clear that special attention must be paid to even the smallest aspects of design, as they can be decisive in a critical moment. How do we view the world of technology we have created after this? How do we learn to perceive it not only with pride for our achievements, but also with sober caution, questioning what other hidden defects might lurk in our designs? What other subtle flaws born of our ignorance, haste, or oversight are embedded in the foundation of our brilliant yet very fragile world? These questions remain relevant to this day. They remind us that progress requires constant attention to detail and responsibility for every decision made on the path to new heights. We sincerely want to thank everyone who watched this episode to the end. Your support, your likes, and subscriptions are very important to us as they allow us to continue creating new content. Don't forget to click the bell to stay updated with the latest news and not miss our new videos. Your attentiveness and interest help us grow and develop. And may this story serve as a reminder that in technology, as in life, achievements are important, but so is the responsibility for every little thing that can have a huge impact.